everyone, and welcome to Preemie Chats for today. Preemie Chats is a place for parents and healthcare professionals to gather, share stories, and learn from each other. I'm your host today, Jenna Morton. I am the preemie mom of 32-week-old twins who are now 10 years old. Preemie Chats is the creation of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, also known as CPBF. The foundation is a parent-led charity that helps families during and after their NICU time through education, support, and advocacy. You can see the website address there on your screen, canadianpreemies.org. Please take some time to visit if you haven't. There's all kinds of resources, links to our previous Preemie Chats. The recording of today's discussion will be there, and you will find an entire community of parents and professionals who are working together to help our children thrive. And this, of course, is a parent-led discussion as well, and we hope that you as a parent or as a healthcare provider will join in throughout our discussion today. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and as we go through our topic, feel free to share your own stories or questions for our guests. Today, I'm going to be joined by two guests to talk about experience outside of the NICU and graduate families and their mental well-being. And our first guest is Christine Cunningham, who is a registered social service worker and certified perinatal mental health professional. She's also the founder of PWO, Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario, which offers therapy and peer support at low or no cost to those who need it. Welcome to Preemie Chats, Christine.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And we also have someone you're often paired up with, Kelley Hassanpour. And Kelley is a registered nurse whose work focuses on families in the NICU and beyond, advocating for infant and maternal mental health. And Kelley is also the founder of Parenting from Within, which offers workshops and group sessions for parents to be and new parents. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you both for taking the time to join me today. And before we really kind of dive into the topic of mental health and after the NICU, maybe you can give us a little bit of a background about what you each do and how you came to do this particular piece of work.
Kelley, do you want to start?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a registered nurse. My introduction to the NICU actually happened when I was in grade 9 for Take a Kid to Work Day. And I kind of fell in love with the environment when I was there. I ended up graduating, obviously, quite a few years later from nursing school, and I ended up being hired into the same unit that I visited in grade 9. I worked there for quite a few years. I worked as a bedside nurse and then moved into a clinical education role for quite a few years until my own son was born. And then having my own son and just really reflecting back on, the care that is being provided in the NICU, I really kind of took a bit of a pivot and started working as a registered nurse psychotherapist. And because of my background, I have a really soft spot for NICU families. And so, now I provide individual therapy for a lot of NICU families and work in combination with Christine, which we'll talk about, to provide an NICU support group as well.
Yeah. And so I am, as you mentioned, Jenna, a registered social service worker. And through my own experience with postpartum anxiety and depression, after my third child, I decided I wanted to go into the helping field and counseling specifically. And so I went back to school and I did that. And then now I focus my practice in private practice on clients with perinatal mental health issues. And of course, seeing clients who've had experiences of having their little ones in the NICU and, seeing kind of sometimes the grief and trauma and the struggles that come with that. And then meeting Kelley through the not-for-profit work and, her sharing her background with me. And the more we talked, we thought, hey, what if we ran a group for families that have been in the NICU, and we developed the curriculum together and launched the group. And we've run a few groups last year and this year, and it's been Fantastic.
Can you talk a little bit more about the structure of the group and what the goal is?
Sure. Here we go.
Yeah,
So
go
it's a 6-week group that we run. It's a closed group, which means that really the people who start in week 1 are the same people who are like in week 6. So we usually have a maximum of 6 to 8 people per group, and our hope is really to connect NICU families with other NICU families, because we know how isolated a lot of families can feel, and can feel like I'm the only one who's had this experience. And then we really we have a topic each week that we break it down. We have kind of like a set curriculum, but we also, like, depending on the needs of the group, will kind of fluctuate what we talk about. But we really talk about, like, each week kind of some of the major themes that we see in NICU families. So things like anxiety, intrusive thoughts, trauma, grief. And so we kind of do like some education around that. And then we try to provide tools each week so that people can use it in real life. And we always say, like, for us, the tools are like, we want to be able to give you tools that you can use in the moment with a baby in your lap, kind of thing. That we know, we could tell you to go and take like an hour-long yoga class, but that's probably not going to happen. So, like, what are things you can do that are like 10 seconds long to just hopefully like calm your nervous system a little bit? Christine, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty that's the gist of it. And even that, like Kelley said, connecting families. So of course there's like the therapeutic aspect, because of the work that Kelley and I do, but then also that peer support aspect, which we know is so helpful and can really help in normalizing too all of these things that people might be experiencing. Like, it's not just me. It's, we're not alone in this experience. There's so much power, I think, in that of, me too, we've been through this. And of course, every situation is different, but there's so much similarities in the things that we take away. Yeah. And that's my dog's barking.
It's all right. It's real life, right? Those are the kind of things that, especially as you're, a family preparing to leave with your little one, you do start to really think about all those little things like dogs and visitors and daily life, and how do you cope with all of the things that might have even given you some stress before. And I'm wondering if we can maybe talk about some of those moments and milestones and things that through your work with families you've come to realize these are some things you should maybe be preparing yourself for.
Right. Yeah, like I said, right, there can be a lot of commonalities. And so we do like to talk about symptoms of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And so, just kind of like a quick overview, but that can include anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, psychosis, and post-trauma symptoms. And those can occur throughout the perinatal period, and some of them can occur only postpartum. And so, looking out for those signs and symptoms where people are maybe really not feeling like themselves, really struggling to manage the stress. And of course, especially having a baby in the NICU, and maybe there's older kids at home, that's a highly stressful situation. But it's kind of like the feeling beyond of, I'm really not coping the way I might usually cope. It's really feeling that difference there. Maybe feeling extremely isolated or purposely isolating yourself, where you're like, I don't want to interact with anyone. I don't want to speak to anyone or see anyone. Where it's, again, kind of these things are having a big impact on your life, right? Also kind of, it depends, like maybe not sleeping, or again, if you have older ones or other kids at home, but it's more than just, oh, I'm not sleeping because I have a little one. It's like, I'm waking up even if they're not awake, or I'm not able to fall asleep, or I'm waking up and then I can't get back to sleep. things like that. Disruption to like your eating patterns, your appetite. Those are, that's a good indicator as well, whether it's like I'm not eating at all or like I'm eating a lot more than I normally would. Yeah, I mean, that's like an extremely basic and for sure, like on our website, Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario, you can find like a more exhaustive list of signs and symptoms. And I would encourage anyone to go there and just take a look, like, does this sound familiar for me? And then, yeah, so you mentioned the milestones, Jenna, and kind of, I mean, this is skipping ahead a bit, but, thinking about just different, milestones where we could experience maybe an increase in our symptoms. Like, for example, coming home, right? Like, okay, we're happy, we want to go home, but then there can be like this added anxiety around there, like, oh, wow, I don't have the same level of support that we had in the NICU, right? Then there's maybe like the developmental milestones, and those might look different for a premature baby, of course, right? And so some stress around that of like, well, my baby isn't or hitting their milestones, or it's looking different than maybe, other kids. And then even we talk about anniversaries, but like baby's birthday or, time of year that maybe you were in the NICU can become like an activator for our post-trauma symptoms, even if we've done a lot of work. So we always talk about like take extra care of yourself, and being able to acknowledge like maybe baby's birthday is, yes, on one hand, baby was born and came into the world, and that's lovely. And maybe that was the hardest day of my life because I experienced trauma, or that was the beginning of the hardest time of our lives because then we went into the NICU. Yeah. So yeah. What are your thoughts, Kelley? What am I missing?
Yeah, and I think like in terms of when you see, especially like anniversaries, like birthday, is that a lot of times I know I talk to like an NICU parent who's like maybe 9 months like out, and they're like, I'm feeling okay. Like, I think I'm doing pretty good. And then as you start to like creep more to like closer towards that birthday, they start to see the symptoms start to increase and aren't really sure why they're kind of having what feels sometimes like a setback. The other thing I think too with NICU families is it's so complex, right? Like, so anniversaries can be different things. A lot of families were on a lot of families spent time in a high risk unit before, baby was born. So it could be like the anniversary of like going into the high risk unit, the anniversary of like birthday, like we talked about, but due date anniversary as well. Like, it's so complex.
Yeah, I know personally I've come to notice that when November starts to come around, I need to take care, even 10 years later, because it was November when we had our diagnosis that we were at risk. And that was really where our journey started. And, it's nowhere near our boy's birthday, my original due date, but it does also come up against World Prematurity Day, where, I think all parents who maybe aren't more than 1 year out of their journey should probably keep in mind as well. November 17th, you tend to see a lot more, news stories or, things on social media than you normally would about different families' journeys. And certainly that's a time when it pops up that you might not be expecting it.
Yeah. And you bring up a really great point there too, of like things like people aren't like prepared for as they turn on a TV show. And there's maybe even just chatting about the NICU and how that can really activate your whole system. And really take you by surprise sometimes.
Yeah. And I think, and we're talking about it from our perspective of practitioners and like providers, right? Of support providers and stuff and therapists. And, so we kind of like probably using some language and lingo here and stuff. But I think too, it's important to be able to note how this can show up. So I love that example, right? Of watching TV. So it might not be like, oh my God, I'm having a panic attack and I know what that is. It could be like all of a sudden I'm in a really bad mood, or I'm feeling really angry and I'm snapping at my partner, or I can't sleep that night and I'm having like a lot of, thoughts running through my head and I can't turn my brain off, or even that like sometimes it can be, I see that thing on TV, but I don't connect that it's upsetting to me. And then a couple hours later, I'm constantly thinking about when we were in the NICU or when baby was little, or, you know, intrusive thoughts like pictures and stuff in our minds. You know, we can be activated but not understand what's going on. So again, it's like just noticing those changes, or if you're noticing maybe things like resentment coming up for partner, for baby, for kids, like I like to normalize that, like that's okay, you know, that to have those feelings and those thoughts of, you know, this wasn't the experience I wanted. And sometimes we like to look for like, and whose fault is that? You know, and why did that happen? And, you know, that kind of thing. And even like you said, Jenna, you know, in terms of November, yeah, like seasons, right? So for some people, it's not necessarily the date, like, oh, on this day was my due date or was delivery day or, you know, was the anniversary of the start, but it's like the feeling of like coming into winter and then feel like maybe I was on bed rest or I was stuck in the house and I remember seeing the snow blowing outside and then kind of these like feelings of, and I don't feel great, I don't feel good, or something's going on here, right? Sometimes we don't have the language to like say like, oh, those are post-trauma symptoms, right? Yeah.
What is the power in starting to recognize that, though? What, you know, what does it do for a parent to be able to even start to think that way of like, oh, maybe this is why I'm having this reaction?
Yeah, and I think Christine and I are both, we try to do a lot of education around like your nervous system responds the way that it does without you being consciously aware of it most of the time. And so we know like we do a lot of sort of trauma work around like people who question like, why did I maybe agree to something in the NICU or during birth that I like really didn't want to happen, like want that to happen. But in the moment I found myself saying okay to that. And so we do like a lot of work around like your nervous system makes these like snap decisions for you in these like really high stress times of like basically how it thinks it can best keep you alive. Like what is the safest option for you? And by sort of starting to understand and recognize those responses, and understanding why maybe you made these decisions or why your nervous system is responding right now the way that it is, I think, and I think Christine would agree, one of the best things you can do is give yourself a little compassion of like, right, like I am responding in this way because my system was meant to respond. Like my system thinks it's under threat right now. But then also when you can learn to kind of understand how your own system works and responds and what your own reactions are, then you can start to sort of understand, like recognize it when it's happening and then put the coping skills into place that you've maybe learned. Because I don't know, like Christine and I both had anxiety. Jenna, I'm sure for you coming out of the NICU too, like sometimes the hardest thing is to recognize like when that anxious part of you is taking over.
Well, actually, my husband and I had that conversation a lot because we've both had our own journeys, you know, before we ended up together and before we ended up on our NICU journey. And both of us recognized, you know, if we hadn't learned some of those coping skills for dealing with our own anxiety, recognizing signs of depression, if we hadn't had that before our experience, we would have had a very different experience. And we count ourselves very, very lucky that we had some of those skills in place. And we're in a unit that had peer support and had groups that encouraged families to get together and to talk and to share.
Yeah. And I just want to say here too, Christine, like that to recognize the fact that a lot of times people think like, oh, my baby was only in the NICU for 48 hours. Like compared to this family who was in the NICU for 4 months, like I shouldn't be feeling this way. Mm-hmm. Like there is no should or shouldn't be feeling in this. Like your experience is your experience. Simply being separated from your baby is a form of trauma. And so to like give yourself some compassion even there of like, yeah, only if your stay was just a short stay, it doesn't mean that you can't be experiencing these symptoms too.
Absolutely. And those, if we don't have any treatment, you know, whether that's like talk therapy or, you know, even peer support can be included in a treatment plan. whether it's medication, if, we really need help managing our symptoms, if we don't have any interventions, then those symptoms are not going away. Like, it's not just like, oh, over time, that's going to go away. We need the processing piece to be able to do that, for our symptoms to lessen. And again, they can be reactivated, kind of, and that's not to, like, I don't want people to feel like there's no hope, because there's loads of hope. Like, these signs and symptoms and, things that can be experienced post NICU is they're like really responsive to treatment, to these skills that we talk about in our groups and stuff. But, around an anniversary or a time of year, we can just notice an increase in our symptoms. Like, that's really normal. But absolutely, like Kelley said, it's not the duration or the details of the logistics of it. If we felt in that time, like myself or my baby was in danger, and or like I thought we might die, it doesn't matter like the length of time you felt that, or the length of time you were in the NICU after that feeling. That's that's a big cause of post-trauma symptoms, right? And so the recognition part of being able to just understand, like, this is not like me.
Yeah.
This is not how I normally would deal with, a stressful situation, or my feelings, or snapping at my partner is maybe not something that I'm used to, and, I'm not happy about it, or like something's going on. When we start recognizing that and seeing that more, like Kelley said, we can put those coping skills in place, but also we can start asking, like, maybe I need support, right? First and foremost, like, maybe I need to ask someone about this. Maybe I start with another family that was in the NICU that I connected with while I was there. And I asked, my friend, like, hey, did you experience anything like this? Or I'm feeling really angry all the time. I have no patience for anyone, or whatever is coming out. And then if you realize, like, yeah, this is out of the norm, or, for me, who can I reach out for more support? Is it peer support? Is it like looking for a therapist, or looking for a therapy group, looking for supports through Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, just like starting somewhere, then that opens up the discussion.
I think what's so important. Oh, sorry.
No.
I just wanted to highlight when you were talking there about the fact that it's not something that necessarily happens just after you leave either. I know people years later who have realized, oh, yeah, no, that really, you get that adrenaline rush of I'm strong, I'm going to deal with this, I'm going to make it through. And you do. And maybe, you don't even feel it for another couple years. And then all of a sudden you have these feelings and these thoughts that you have to work through.
I think a lot of that too is like a lot of it goes unrecognized, right? Both like by healthcare professionals and in ourselves. And especially when you have a new baby or babies at home. And then if you add like medically complex babies on top of that, we're like, there's these parts of us that just like are like, I can't deal with myself right now. Like, I'm just going to like sweep that under the rug and I'll deal with it kind of later. Like, I just don't have time for that right now. But I always liken like symptoms like mental health symptoms, like of anxiety, depression, whatever, as like anybody who has children who can speak, is I'm like, those like anxious parts of us, or those traumatic parts of us are kind of like a toddler trying to get your attention, right? They're like, mom, 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 mom. And then when you don't answer them, they're like, mom, mom, right? So maybe like it was just a quiet voice trying to get your attention when you had a baby, like when you had your baby's first home, but now you're 2 years later and now they're like yelling at you a lot louder. To try to get your attention.
And I definitely see that a lot in clients where, they'll come to me like seeking support at like an individual therapy, and maybe like baby's 6 months old or a year old, for example, or beyond, right? Where all of a sudden they're like, I was fine. I don't know what's wrong with me all of a sudden. Like we went through an NICU stay. I remember specifically like, a client who like we were there for like 2 months, and I handled it and I was fine. And like my baby's fine now. My baby's 6 months old now, and we're doing fine and everyone's good. And now I can't cope. Why? And exactly like Kelley was saying, like when we're in that moment and like that, you know, babies are little and we're just like, we're in survival mode, right? So we're in survival mode and somehow we do it, right? We're not thriving, but we're surviving. But then it's like as like baby gets bigger and let's say maybe they're sleeping more, so you're sleeping more, and maybe you're on like a bit more of some type of routine ish, you know, then all of a sudden there's like more room. Like I'm not just surviving, like I'm getting sleep. So my brain is able to like process more. There's more room there to like have thoughts, you know, that are not just focused on like survival. And so then all of a sudden there's more room for the brain and the nervous system to be like, oh, that was a scary thing. What just happened like 6 months ago? But what happened? Right. And now like I'm trying to process. And so now there's maybe those intrusive thoughts coming in around what you went through or baby's health and safety, even if you're like, but baby's healthy, baby's fine, like the medical complications resolved, like things are good. But now I'm really scared for their health and for them getting sick and that kind of stuff. Cause it's almost like you have more capacity for all this stuff to come in. I hope that makes sense.
And I think the other thing that we see happen a lot too is like baby hits like 6-9 months and everybody around you is like, well, they're fine now. Like, you're fine now. Like, why aren't you coming to this big birthday party? Why aren't you coming to this? And, you know, I hear all the time the people being like, but my baby's not like every other baby, right? Like my baby is an NICU baby. And I think especially when we looked at the last year, where I always say to people, I'm like, you were parenting in an like, not to overuse the word unprecedented time, but it was unprecedented. Like you still had COVID going on. You had an influenza outbreak going on. You had RSV going on. And there was very little access to medication too. And ERs were full. Like, of course you're anxious about going out with your baby. But when the rest of the world isn't living in the same kind of area of concern as you, it can be so isolating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about how to deal with those feelings. You know, we've talked about the fact that all of these feelings, whatever you are feeling out there, is valid, and you're not alone, even though it might feel that way. But what are the steps and some of the skills and things that the tools you can help people with?
Yeah. I think that first step of really being able to recognize what am I feeling, that is crucial. That also is so helpful. I think that's like the hardest part and the biggest part. But then once we do that, often like the rest comes a little bit easier or like almost sometimes on its own. But that recognition, because we want to feel the feelings. So we really try to encourage people, okay, like let's try to recognize, what is it I'm feeling? What does that feel like in my body? What are the emotions that I recognize with those physical symptoms? And what are those thoughts that come with that? And then can I sit with that and feel it, right? And really allow myself to maybe, I'll take fear. Fear is a pretty common one and it's an easy one to illustrate, but can I sit with that, maybe that tightness in my chest and that ball in my belly that is telling me like something's wrong? And can I feel that fear and then listen to the thoughts? I'm really scared that if we go to this birthday party, baby's going to get sick and they are an NICU baby. There's other complications and things that I have to worry about if they do catch a cold or the flu or something like that. So there's validating, normalizing, like, of course you're scared. That sounds so scary, right? And being able to, like, we model that so that people can hopefully model that for themselves, like between sessions and after group ends, just feeling it. And then how do we soothe ourselves after that feeling, right? So we want to acknowledge the feelings, we want to feel them, and with compassion, and do that with compassion. And then we want to do something to soothe our nervous system. And so we talk a lot about how can we activate our vagus nerve, which tells our nervous system to basically calm down. So our parasympathetic nervous system. And so we want to do things that are like moving our body or connection to other humans, laughter, crying. A big old cry really helps soothe the nervous system. Things like cold water therapy. And so again, we talk about how do we do this with a baby. So let's say you go to the bathroom, you can wash your hands in cold water or let the water like run on your wrists. That can help activate the nervous system. Things like, even holding an ice cube, that's going to really bring you to the present moment, right? So it's something like you can do while you're kind of walking around or doing whatever at home, but it is going to bring you to the present moment because you're like, wow, that is cold.
Yeah. I would say like you can pay hundreds of dollars to go do the like cold immersion therapy. That's all over Instagram and whatever right now. But I'm like, or when you hop into the shower, you can turn your shower to really cold water and it's the same thing.
Which I do.
I was gonna say, I have a lot of friends who are very much the proponent of that, like the first and the last 30 seconds of the shower, just cold. But I had not heard the ice cube trick, and now I'm like, oh,
yeah.
I can think through how that would help. Help.
No, I even say to people like, if you also want to drink more water, because that can also help you feel better, is like put your stainless steel cold like water bottle in the fridge overnight and then pull it out. Now you have cold water to drink, which is going to help soothe you, and you can hold the cold water too, which can help.
I make a tray of ice cubes a day, and I've never even I wonder if somehow that's just always been my system telling myself to do that. That's why I'm like, no, if I'm going to drink water, I need cold water.
Yeah. Well, I think if you like tune into your body, like if we actually paid attention to our body a lot of the times, like this is just, there's no medical science behind this. This is just my opinion. Is like whenever I feel overwhelmed, like especially when my son was a baby, I usually start humming or singing to myself. And that is another way that you activate the vagus nerve, which helps to bring that like calm nervous system back on board. So I think sometimes like if we paid attention to what we do have natural coping skills.
Yeah. And that's a good point too. Again, always like trying to bring this back to like, how can we do this with little ones? And interestingly enough, when mine were little, this was before I was in this field. So I had no idea about any of this stuff, but like dance parties, we loved dance parties and singing, right? So like we're moving our bodies and singing, activating that vagus nerve, letting out some of that energy by dancing and moving, which is like a great way to soothe ourselves, right? And then you're also, so what I love about this stuff too, figuring out what can I do with a baby and with kids in the home, right? So that helps me be able to do it. The other thing is I'm modeling this for my kids, and because they're learning, especially as toddlers, like they're learning, well, and babies too, but how to co-regulate their nervous system, and they're using our nervous system to do that, right? And so if we're doing these things together, that can be a great way to like teach them these skills without having to like do it overtly, because you're like, I'm doing this for myself, and they're learning at the same time. So.
And another just super easy one that Christine alluded to as well is just that whole like recognizing that the feeling is happening or the emotion is happening. And if you've ever heard the phrase name it to tame it, it's really like I always say to clients, I'm like, I challenge you. The next time you're feeling angry or overwhelmed is like either say it out loud or just say it in your head and be like, wow, I feel angry. Or like, I feel overwhelmed, and then just notice, because oftentimes just by like speaking it or like even thinking it out loud, you'll find that it just gives you a little bit more space to kind of calm yourself down.
And that's why I said oftentimes, like, I really feel like that part, like the recognizing, the acknowledging tends to be the biggest part and like kind of that big gateway into coping. Because like Kelley said, that is so helpful. I use that for my anxiety and I model that with my kids, right? I'm not asking them to be my therapist, but I'm like, and mine are older, so I can, say a bit more, but I'll say, hey guys, like my anxiety's pretty high today. I need you guys to not be so loud because they're really loud. and I have sensory issues, and that heightens my anxiety when they're like stomping around the house. So I'll saying it out loud, oh, I'm feeling really anxious. And sometimes I say it out loud and I'm alone, like I'm just, in my office or I'm doing whatever, and I'm like, oof, I'm feeling really anxious right now. 9 times out of 10, that's half the battle. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then I can like ask for what I need, or I can, take a drink of cold water and notice how it's, running down my esophagus and whatever, like be really in touch with my body. And then ask the kids like, for what I need. So they're seeing, okay, I'm struggling with my anxiety and I'm asking for help. I'm modeling that as a coping skill. And they're also most of the time responding by being a little quieter. So that's helpful.
You mentioned their reaction to different sensory triggers and that type of thing. And I know that's a very common thing for both, parents who've been in the NICU, because there's so many sights and sounds and smells and things that, down the road you can have a reaction to something. But also for our children, especially now, our boys are 10, like I said, and having talked with lots of other parents, there's definitely sensory issues that are very common among a lot of preemies, that they can't articulate why it might be there because their brain, the part that can tell us what's happening, doesn't remember. Yeah. And so I'm wondering if there's any other little tips and tricks like that might work as well for little ones as it does for parents.
Kelley, you go for it.
So yeah, I think you hit on a really great point. Is a lot of times, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, like they were just babies, they don't remember. And we now know like there's been so much work done in the last like decade on the nervous system and the brain, is that we know that things that happen to us before we're verbal do stay with us. They just stay with us in a different way. So there's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's all about trauma and how trauma lives in our bodies. And so, no, we may not have the words to be able to say what happened to us, but we do, like it will, those neural networks were developed and they are there. And so things like, I know I've heard a lot of like premature babies who have really sensitive heels, or who like, often walk on their toes and that kind of thing, because most babies who've been in the NICU have had a ton of heel pricks done. But I think even like in the NICU world, like this is just something that's kind of starting to be acknowledged and looked at, about how these things do stay with us, even though we were teeny tiny. Christine and I both practice from a modality that's like very, I don't even know how to explain it really. That really does look at things, like it can bring up things that happened pre-verbally, that sort of thing.
Yeah, like those parts of us that hold the trauma, right? And so then if you think of sensory issues, like that's your body reacting, right? So it's like my body is holding this trauma in parts somewhere, right, in my body, my nervous system. And so, for example, hearing a loud noise, right, or like smelling a certain smell, right, or I think hand sanitizer can be one of those smells of like you smell and you're like, oh, that was the hand sanitizer in the NICU. That was the hand sanitizer in the hospital, or whatever, right, like at the front door every time we walked in and used it, or things like that. It's like so powerful, right, because we're still holding those trauma memories and feelings in our body, in those parts. Yeah. So sorry, Kelley, go ahead.
That didn't really answer your question though, did it, whatsoever? I think one of the biggest things you can do with little kids is the whole name it to tame it thing with them. And so maybe I don't know why exactly your heels are really like sensitive, just to use that as an example, although we can probably guess as to why their heels are so sensitive. But I think it's the same thing as like when you're dealing with adults, is like believing their experience, right? And validating their experience. Like as somebody who would consider themselves a highly sensitive person and doesn't like tags in their clothing, as a kid, my parents were like, get over it kind of thing, right? Like there was no room for that kind of thing. But I think one of the most powerful things you can do for your kids is believe them and be like, oh, those tags are really bothering you, or those socks are really bothering you. I get it. Okay, let's change them kind of thing. And so I think it's like believing their experience, validating their feelings, just like adults want to have happen. And then to just support them through that, whatever feeling comes with that, and supporting those feelings.
Yeah. Because there's so many different like ones that can come up, but then also like, so acknowledging that with compassion, I think just noticing too, right? Again, starting with the noticing. For example, my youngest, so two out of myself and two out of three of my kids, we have ADHD and anxiety. And so I now understand my sensory issues and all that stuff. But so then recognizing in my kids, like as they, were growing up, and when my youngest was little and we went anywhere there was loud noise, he'd always go like this every time. And I was like, like, I'm curious about that, right? Like, why is he doing that? And so now I understand, right, that sensitivity to noise. But it's like just being curious about that, as
not judging it.
Yeah, as opposed to judging it, right? Or like just, again, the socks thing, like I cannot cope. I have whatever I'm doing, I have to stop what I'm doing and fix my sock if it's the like a millimeter off. I cannot cope. So when my kids like do things like that, I'm like, yeah, dude, like that's super annoying. I get it. Like, let's fix it. You know what I mean? Which can be hard. I also want to say on a side note, it can be really hard when we have little ones and we're stressed or we're not sleeping, or maybe we have more than one or whatever. Even one is very stressful, but like, and you're in it and you're like, we got to go to the store. Like, I don't care about your sock. Like, we got to get to school or whatever. I get it. I fully get it. But taking the minute to just be curious about it or whatever, even just give them compassion. Like, yeah, buddy, like that sounds like so annoying. Can we fix it in the car? Or, I promise we'll get it fixed. It's hard, but try where you can.
I feel like you're describing every day of my life right now. But it's because
it's mine.
I picked up tags off the floor today because I have at least one who, without a doubt, is going to cut the tag out of every piece of clothing that comes into the house. And yeah, I just kind of had to make peace with it and like, okay, yeah, this is what we do. And so sometimes I think ahead and do it, and other times I don't. And then I got to the point where holes were ending up next. I'm like, okay, I need to get you some better scissors. So when you go to do this yourself, you don't ruin the clothes, just the tag.
Yeah. And then even I think too, and again, you don't have to be like me with, neurodiversity to have sensitivity. So again, if we have like high anxiety, we are going to be super sensitive to noises or like our environment or sounds, smells, all those things. And also like having a baby and like being in charge of a baby's care is going to heighten our senses, right? Like just so that we can be there for a baby when they need us. And so the biggest one, and I'm sure Kelley, you'll agree with this, is babies crying, which is so activating. So it's activating for a reason, because we need to respond, because that's how they talk to us and tell us they need something. But when there's anxiety on board or post-trauma symptoms, that activation can go from 0 to 60 in a flash and be extremely challenging to deal with. And give us those feelings of like, I need to get out of here. Maybe I get into flight mode. Like I need to run away. Like I cannot cope with this baby. It's really hard. And so that's where like those soothing our nervous system is going to help us to like come down a bit and be able to cope with that crying. Like if baby has colic, I mean, we could do all the coping skills in the world. That's really hard, but at least give us a bit of room to be able to cope. And so those sensory issues, if you're experiencing post-trauma symptoms or high anxiety, will be present for you as well as the adult.
And I think too, to recognize that, if you're in a situation where there are two parents in the home, both parents can be having different reactions and both have these kind of reactions. I'm sure he won't mind me sharing the story, but I remember my husband having that, like walking into a room, looking at a crying baby going, I don't know what to do, and left and went for a walk. And he came back, but he had this but at the time, to me, I was like, I was okay. I was prepared for babies to cry. I was fine in that moment. And it took me a long time to realize how much that was his anxiety at work and his fear of all the things that this not knowing what to do as the baby was crying really spiraled into all these other worries, and how, like you say, just even the noise of it amplified it all even more.
And I think you bring up a really great point there of like a lot of times there's this perception that like birth trauma and ICU trauma only happens to the person who gave birth. And I'm like, I can still picture just about every partner who walks into the NICU with this like for their first visit, and they have that like, it's like a classic like deer in the headlights look of like, I don't know whether I'm supposed to be here with my baby. I don't know if I'm supposed to be over there with my partner, especially if baby, like if there was a transfer in hospitals too. Like there's just, it's so complex that partners often get left out and don't get the recognition of like trauma can happen to both partners or anybody else who was there as a support person.
Yeah, even like grandparents too. I think we don't talk enough about grandparents or other supports, other like outside of the parents. If there's two parents, like it is important to remember that these experiences can absolutely be traumatizing, for any of the adults in the situation, right? And that's a good point too, is that also remembering not just trauma symptoms, but also any perinatal mood or anxiety disorder symptoms other than psychosis. That's going to come if we've given birth. But any of the other symptoms can come out in the non-gestational parent, the parent that didn't give birth, right? And also this is true for families who have adopted, right? And so it's really important to understand that, like, if you are the non-gestational partner, if you didn't give birth, to be able to recognize like if some of these symptoms are coming up for you.
Yeah. And siblings as well. A lot of us, when we have our NICU journey, may already have children at home, and, they're impacted as well and part of the process. And I know we've done, chats in the past about specifically looking at, how to involve siblings and how to watch out for siblings as well. But like you say, it's not just the infant and who gave birth to the infant. It is everyone, and everyone has to figure out, how they interact with this new dynamic, right? Yeah, we often talk in our family about the circle, and if you're at the center of the circle, you can tell people on the outside how you're feeling, but if you're on the outside rings, whichever ring on the outside you are, just put it out. Don't if you're the grandparent who's struggling, don't necessarily tell the parent about it. Find the next circle out that can be the comforting ear, because it can just kind of it builds up if you keep pushing it back into the center.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Before we wrap up our discussion today, what other, is there anything else that you guys would like to touch on about mental health and wellness, kind of in that early post NICU phase, maybe?
Yeah, I think one of the things is we often talk about is to, again, like just give yourself compassion. Like I always say this, I say this with non-NICU families, with just parents, like in general, of like, if you can say to yourself, like, I'm having a hard time because this is hard, as opposed to like, I'm having a hard time, what's wrong with me? To just be like, I'm having a hard time because this is really hard. It's huge to give yourself that compassion, and to remember that you potentially are going to have trauma symptoms. Like it's pretty normal, quote unquote, to have trauma symptoms in that like really initial post NICU, like in the NICU, just outside of the NICU, because that's your brain and your nervous system trying to figure out like what just happened to you. Mm-hmm. And that there is support out there. You're not alone. Yeah, as cliche as it can kind of sound, but
it's so true. And knowing too that, like, again, if you've been through something traumatic, if the NICU stay did feel traumatic for you, or parts of it felt traumatic, it is normal, like Kelley said, to have those post-trauma symptoms of maybe flashbacks, nightmares, maybe some dissociation where we're kind of checking out some days because we're like, this is too much. That is your brain and your body processing what just happened. Like Kelley said, we actually want this to happen so that we can process the trauma. it's when that is interrupted, or we don't have like the ability or the chance for our brain and our body to do those things, then it can linger. It can also linger for other reasons, just, if it really impacted us. The other side to that is, just because you've had a NICU stay does not mean you are going to come out of that with PTSD. So for anyone, watching and listening, is like, just because you've been in the NICU or you're there now does not mean you're going to come out of this with complex post-trauma symptoms, not be able to cope, and it's going to be a total disaster. That's just not true. We don't know, right? And there's support. And the other thing, I know this is kind of random, but I know Kelley does too. We like to normalize intrusive thoughts. We didn't really like talk about it, but as a symptom, that it's 100% of people have intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are just those unwanted, random thoughts that pop into our head at any time. So if you think about being a human, that happens all the time. Intrusive thoughts can be scary. They can be violent. They can be sexual in nature. They can be weird. They can be all the things. We have intrusive thoughts all the time. But when we're experiencing anxiety, and maybe higher levels of anxiety or post-trauma symptoms, we can have more intrusive thoughts. Also, when we bring a baby into the world or into our family, we are going to have more intrusive thoughts. That's just our brain telling us, like, hey, look at all the dangerous things that can happen. Make sure you protect your baby, right? This is very typical, but people often get really activated and distressed by these thoughts. We like to talk about it as much as possible. Like, this is typical. Your brain is trying to tell you, be careful, keep baby safe. Thank you. Take care of yourself through that if it is distressing. And that usually means there's a higher level of anxiety present. So do what you need to do there, whether it's seek support or do the things to take care of yourself to minimize those intrusive thoughts.
That's so important for like you say, for everyone to hear at any stage. I think all of this information is very helpful, whether it's post NICU or just life in general.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to be with us here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
And thank you for joining, everyone. My guests today were Christine Cunningham and Kelley Hassanpour. And if you want to rewatch any portion of this discussion, or you have someone that you think might benefit from seeing it and listening to it, you can send them to CanadianPreemies.org, the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation website. You will be able to replay this discussion there. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca, for their ongoing support of our educational programs, as well as our partners at the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses and FICARE. Preemie Chats is here every Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. I hope that you can join us again next week, and I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.